adoption is one of the most kind of profound decisions that I think as a social worker you're involved in, but is even more profound for the parents who lose their children, for the children who end up being placed with adoptive parents, and for adoptive parents themselves. And it ripples out as well into each of their, you know, families and the systems that they're situated in. So we're really grateful to be, you know, with the lineup that we have today in terms of the conversation, because we trust that it will be done with sensitivity and rigor, and and hopefully we can learn something.
Yeah, and we've got to be chock full of experience in the lineup, so we're really grateful for the speakers for giving their time. And we've got Clarissa Stevens, who is a founding member, actually sort of coined the concept of relational activism, really, didn't you, Clarissa? Is that, I think that's fair.
I don't know about that, yeah.
What was your...
We're taking that a little bit too far.
Well, what was your... I do remember what you said that day, and it's always remained with me, about your take on what you're up to now as far as the advocacy and the activism you're engaged with. Yeah.
So, sorry, Tim. Was that a question?
That was me being over elaborate and subtle in my question. Sorry. No, I remember you talking about how, because you know the experiences that you've had, and maybe you'd tell us a little bit about that, and what you've done with that since.
Okay.
Really, yeah.
So I'm a birth parent. A lot of you, I had a quick look through the participants. I know of a lot of you anyway. I've met a lot of people that are here, so hi and welcome. But for those that don't know, about 10 years ago, my children were adopted. It's not even about 10 years ago. It's exactly 10 years ago that I said goodbye to them, actually, in June. So we've passed it already. And that was following an abusive relationship, and it was found that the courts didn't think that I was capable of taking care of my children just because I was so emotionally detached at the time. And then after my children were adopted, I was like in this like very dark place, and I was searching for some sort of a void, something to fill the gap of the loss of losing my children. And I remember it, you know, thinking, oh, maybe I should just go and have another baby, or maybe and I went and got a dog, and it was like, okay, well, that's given me a little bit of purpose now. But like emotionally and mentally and physically, like my whole identity had just completely changed. And I really didn't know who I was. And I remember I would go out in the morning and take the dog for a walk, and I used to take it to this field, and it could be pouring down with rain, and I'd be screaming, like, because I was so confused and and I didn't know what to do next and what my purpose was in life. And then slowly over the years, I was having therapy. And then I started meeting different people in different places, like Tim and lots of other people from other local authorities, and work kind of just started coming my way. It wasn't that I was searching for anything, but with that, it came with lots of learning and lots of training and lots of guidance and lots of support and lots of hand-holding and just so much love, like, throughout that process. And I guess that's what's led up to being a relational activist, and that's what relational activism is to me, supporting people, guiding people, being able to just share love in those moments of crisis and in those moments of pain, and just sharing that you believe in someone sometimes. And those were all the things that kind of kept me strong and kept me going and held me through some of the worst times of my life.
And Clarissa, you've really been able to do that for other people over a long period of time. You mentioned all of those that you recognise, the names you recognise on the call, and you've really been there for others. And there's some recent talk, and we've showcased here the recent developments in peer parental advocacy. You can check out some of the other webinars on our website for that. But you've been advocating for a long time, and we know that there's people out there in community and across social networks and with lived experience that are doing that significant work. And it's really incredible that you've been able to do that. So thank you for co-facilitating this this webinar. And we'd be really pleased if you're able to come in and respond to the different speakers as we go through the hour. That would be fantastic. The first speaker that we have, that we're going to hear from, is Julie Young for the Centre for Research on Children and Families in UEA. How are you, Julie? Are you there?
I'm doing fine, Tim. Yep, I'm here, and I'm just going to have a go at sharing my screen. So do put your thumbs up if you can see
skills. Julie gave us a lesson in Zoom this morning, which we're really grateful for. So yeah, are you excellent? So I can see that clearly on the screen.
Fabulous.
Yeah. So take it away. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Tim. Really honoured to be here. I hadn't heard about these webinars until Tim approached me. So it's really fabulous, one, to be here, but also to know that I'm now in the system, and I'll hopefully hear about lots of other ones that are happening too. So great, and great to meet you all in this strange virtual way. So yes, I'm based at the University of East Anglia, and along with my colleagues Beth Neal and others, we've been researching adoption, and particularly contact in adoption, for around 25 years. So I've got about 10-15 minutes to summarise all that work. So apologise if it's going to be a bit of a whirlwind. I also want to just apologise for using the word contact as well, because it does sound very clinical and cold and isn't at all like people actually do experience relationships. But it's an umbrella term, and people will use the words that suit their families. So I just wanted to say that at the very beginning, because I don't like it, but it is sort of a quick and easy way of kind of summarising all kinds of connections that people might have in their kind of web of relationships around adoption. So 25 years of research in this area. What we've kind of gained from all that is a growing understanding that things do need to change in the way that we've been doing adoption. I think that maybe in the past we were too focused on the positives of adoption, and there are many, so it's not to say there aren't. We're creating families, loving families when we do adoption, but I just think that there's been a tendency to brush the more negative experiences under the carpet, and we haven't really looked seriously at the kind of more negative feelings and experiences that adoption can bring about for young children, for older children, teenagers and adults as well. And I'll spend the sort of first bit of this presentation just kind of showing you some of the things that people have said to us that we really need to deal with. We need to move forward with these very real and very distressing feelings. But firstly, a slide that's very busy. I'm not going to read all this out, but I just wanted to show you that it's not just us saying this at UEA. It's there's a whole body of people everywhere now that are recognising that we do need to change our approach to adoption, including the president of the family courts, Andrew McFarlane. He said that in 2017, 2018, we need to change the way we do adoption. The House of Lords, in their report looking at the Children and Families Act, they actually said in a really hard-hitting way that if we don't modernise adoption, we're in danger of actually undermining the whole system. So it's there's a whole body of people out there. Adoption UK, there's a quote further down that list there from Adoption UK, who are in touch with adoptive families across the country, and they're picking up a change as well in adoptive parents. They're also saying that they're frustrated, that sometimes they can see that there needs to be more open contact in adoption, do things differently, and the system is stopping them. So yeah, it's not just us at UEA, but certainly at UEA, our interviews, our surveys, we've done many over 20 years that I've been working there as a researcher. And we've heard from people, adopted young people, adopted children, adopted adults in surveys and interviews. We've heard that there's a real need to know who you are. And that's often a struggle when you're adopted. And they talk about the real experience of loss that they have around their adoption as well. Even young children say that to us. But this quote is actually from an adopted adult who took part in one of our surveys with PAC UK. And they said that knowing who you are and your roots are vital. Family ties confirm that. I've never met my birth brothers. We were adopted separately. We only found out about each other in our late 50s. We're always thinking about how life might have been if we'd known each other. A raw wound that never heals. And I think that shows that even if you have no memory of kind of losing your brothers, it can still be a real loss that you can feel when you become aware that you had this family, but you never had a chance to have relationships with them as well. But also, I think we need to be much more tuned into the damage that we do to very young children when they have people in their lives, siblings, grandparents, but of the wide birth family web who suddenly disappear. And what that must do to someone who has this kind of awareness that people in their life can just disappear in a way that's hard to understand, how damaging that can be. Teenagers that we spoke to show very clearly to us that it's a loss that's really hard to talk about with their family because they feel loyal to their adoptive parents. They feel they don't want to upset them. I'm hearing this so much from young people, that it is really hard to talk about, even if they know their adoptive parents are, love them to bits and they say you can talk about anything. Still is hard to talk about. And I think this quote shows clearly, this was one of our teenagers who we spoke to, who said, I've woken up and cried in my sleep. I imagine my dad in my mind. I want to ask, how did my dad die? Things like that. Am I able to get in contact with my mum? How would I go about doing that? It's a loss that's really, really ambiguous because it's not complete. It doesn't end suddenly. And unlike a bereavement that your whole community can feel at once together, you can feel very alone, very isolated in your thoughts. You're the only one in your family who has this birth mum, this birth dad. It's different to the rest of your adoptive network, and so you can feel very alone in these thoughts. And I think not just us, but many other researchers like Julie Selwyn and others across the country have shown the difficulties in young people growing up and not really understanding their life story. We do life story work with children in foster care. We give adopted children a mandatory life story book, but it never really answers those questions. And one of our young people said to us, I still no idea why I was adopted. I was given by my foster parents just basic information like one picture. I don't think that's enough to go on. I can remember when I was about 10 and it really bothered me. Why was I adopted? Why couldn't I see my mother? And I still feel mixed, completely mixed, like a roller coaster. Sometimes I'm upset I can't see her. I become angry. Why did you give me up from adoption? It's just confusion. And this young person said he was about 10 when he started having these strong feelings. And that's really common to see that children kind of hit that middle childhood age when their logical thinking develops, their understanding of the world develops that bit more. And suddenly they often have these questions about, well, what is a real family and why am I different to other people? And it is really hard to understand, but particularly it's hard to understand when things are kept that bit secret and it's not something you really talk about and you can't see these people. It's not a simple closure to their situation. These people are still out there. And researchers have shown that not being clear why you were adopted or not really being able to talk about it is quite damaging, well, very damaging for people. It can leave them really unsettled in their placement, have issues with trust in the adults around them. So yeah, lots of stories from young people, from adopted adults who tell us that, yeah, we're left with really difficult feelings in adoption. And also birth relatives, of course, for them as well. It's an ending that some people say to us is worse than someone dying because you're left with not knowing where they are. Your children could be anywhere. Anything could be happening to them. You just don't have that information. And as this person said, it's destroying me. So we're also damaging people, young, vulnerable parents, vulnerable people who are having their children removed as well. So should we be doing things differently with contact? There was a review that was done a few years ago, which looked at lots of different studies around contact and looked at how it linked to well-being. Trying to answer the question, how should we do contact? And the key conclusion from that, this was with the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, the key conclusion from that was, actually contact can be really beneficial. It can help with some of these difficult issues that I presented in those early slides. But what we shouldn't be focused on is like how much contact, what type of contact, but just about it being good quality. It's quality contact that is really meeting the children's needs that matters. And the children's needs being important. It's their views, it's their feelings that matter. Children, young people, they're all different. Some can be much more curious than others, and we need to try and link into where they're at, where their needs are, what they need to know about their life story, about their relationships, and try to make sure that whatever contact we do, it really is helping with their questions and their needs around relationships. We need to make sure also that we've got a much broader view of the birth family. We're not just thinking about parents. There's a whole network of people that could be really beneficial to the child, the young person growing up in their adoptive family. Grandparents, the wider extended family, can actually have really positive relationships where there's no need to cut them off. Siblings, no need to cut them off, and they can be so valuable to them as they grow up that they've shared that journey with their birth family. Also, they can be a really good source of information about their life story as well. We need to make sure that we're all clear about the purpose of contact as well. It really is helping this young person with their lifelong needs around adoption, and making sure that we're not just doing cut and paste plans, but we are making sure we're thinking what's right for this child, with their family, the links that they have, who is out there, who could be important to them, and make sure that they're supporting it. So what about adopted adults? We hear so many people say, well, we don't think they're going to like contact, they want it to be their child. Well, we shouldn't be thinking about it being their child. We shouldn't be thinking about children in that possessive way. The right adoptive parents are always going to be the people who think about the child's needs first and think about what's right for them. But what I found really interesting when we talk to adoptive parents who do have contact is actually they do feel that knowing more, the more you know about the birth family, actually the more it helps benefit the child. The more you can talk to them about their birth family, the more you feel closer to them, that you're sharing this birth family experience. In a closed adoption, we hear parents say it's hard to talk about adoption. It's hard to bring it up. But if we can show our child that there's no secrets, that everything about them, including their birth family links, is valuable, we're open to that, we're open to everything, then that's a really good message to the young person, that there's no secrets. Your whole self is important to me, that they're welcoming everything about that young person. So many of them say it helps them to talk about adoption, helps them to open up, helps them to talk about feelings, their own feelings and their child's feelings, and that it does help them to become closer together. But the way we've done contact in the past, well, and still in many local authorities, although we are hearing about changes, which is great, but it still is this cut and paste. It will be letterbox with birth parents once or twice a year. We don't write letters anymore. And we're finding that so many of these letterbox contact plans just stop. They don't carry on beyond the early years of adoption. We're finding that the child just ends up in a closed adoption, knowing nothing, because they just fail, they just stop. People aren't used to writing letters anymore, and it's particularly difficult for birth parents who have lost their children, had this hugely traumatic event happen, and they're expected to write a letter to strangers, an impossible task about such an emotional topic. And we feel that children too struggle with it as well, that often they're not kept in the loop with it, maybe they're not even told about it till much later. And adoptive parents struggle with what to write when they don't know the people they're writing to. So it's an outdated format that we're trying to make work when people don't know each other. It's very infrequent. You don't get feedback about how your letters are received. Quite often there's delays. Children told us in recent focus groups that the letters they had from their birth parents feel a bit like a business letter. They didn't really have anything personal in them, mainly because I guess we've been quite risk-averse with letters. We've been too much giving people what they can't say and not what they can say, struggling to make them personal and real to people. Yet our children tell us they want to feel connected to these people. They want to feel they know them, that they are real people. One of our teams said to us, you love your adoptive parents a bit, but you don't want them being concerned or making decisions for you. It should be about us, these letters. They should be meaningful to us. They need to be rewarding, informative, and they need to keep going. But of course, if they're not rewarding, They are just going to stop. If people don't know what to write, they're struggling with it, they're just going to stop. So what about face-to-face contact? Unfortunately, that's rarely considered, and so it does often lead to unnecessary loss. I say unfortunately, of course, meetings do need to be safe. We need to make sure that it only happens in a way that is safe and right for a child, but I'm not always sure we're thinking creatively about face-to-face contact, or thinking about ways that we can make maybe letterbox contact more real for people, maybe by using more digital ways of contact, maybe by using more video or audio. And there's some trials going on around the country now where we are being a lot more creative with our contact and trying to think about ways we can make it meaningful. Because of course we don't want unsafe meetings either. But what is even worse is young people who are growing up feeling that their needs aren't met, wondering who these people are out there, and maybe initiating contact themselves in the teenage years. So that is going to be the worst situation. So often if we can make meetings safe and right with the right birth relatives that work for the child, then maybe we can avoid some of that really truly unsafe meetings happening. So what we're starting to feel from the research, and we're seeing this starting to move around the country now, is that with the full range of contact should be considered. We really should be looking at every family on an individual basis. And we should be focusing on making it safe, but also quality, and should be supported, should be rewarding, reducing that, what is really dangerous, unmediated, unsupported contact. And I think it's really interesting when we think about quality contact. It doesn't always mean, you know, just positive, in that it's, what I mean is it's not always going to be just enjoyable. Sometimes contact is enjoyable. This person we've called Kira had really positive contact with her birth nan. She said we felt like a real family. We'd go somewhere normal. She was like a nan. I hugged her. You know, that was really positive quality contact. But she also talks about awkward contact with her birth mum. But she says it was still really valuable because it helped me know who she was and what she was like. So I didn't have a fantasy about her. I didn't have this kind of need to meet her. And yet with my dad, he's the one I haven't been allowed to see. He makes me want to know more and see him more. So what quality contact is doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be, you know, always enjoyable, but it's meeting a child's needs. It's helping them explore their story. That's the most important thing. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind, but just to finish with where we're going now at UEA, we're working closely with the National Adopted Team and their Maintaining Relationship subgroup, and we're trying to work on a theory of change around adoption and contact. We're trying to look at how we can put the adopted person's lifelong needs at the centre, make decisions that are right for them, really rethink risk, not to be too risk adverse, but rethink what actually is really risky for this child in this situation. We do know we've got to increase resources, and we've also got to build understanding and collaboration between all groups. But most of all, we really need to change unhelpful master narratives around adoption as being some sort of rescue mission where the birth family is all bad and the child is now moving off into a new family and they don't need to think about their birth family. We're also looking at how we can work on everybody needs to change in the system. We need to make it right for the adoptee in the middle, but there's lots of different people involved who can all have an impact in making things change for this young person. At the beginning of adoption, they're powerless. It should be about them, but they have no say in the decisions. And so we're looking at all these different groups, professionals, and all the different parties involved in adoption to see how we can make changes. We're looking at trying to recruit a person who can be a champion within local authorities and help us lead on that culture change. We're looking more in depth at how we can prepare adopters to be much more open around adoption, to hear from people with lived experience like Carissa and learn from how things can work in different ways. We need to make sure that we are making child-focused contact plans, supporting relationships, and truly meeting the needs of all adults affected by adoption. So that's where I'm going to finish. I was just going to leave this slide up because that's my new research where I'm speaking to people who are under SGO as well. If you've got contacts with families where a young person is being raised under SGO, then that's our latest research at UEA. But I'd like to stop there.
Julie, thank you. Thank you so much for condensing that thorough survey of the context, and also those very powerful voices as well of lived experience. So really grateful, and thanks to Denise Smalley, who's been doing some great work in the chat with the links, and who made the link with Julie. So really appreciate that, and do get in touch with Julie around her research. We're going to do that in Camden. And Clarissa, some real deep stuff there, wasn't there? Yeah.
But all actually for me very familiar. So I mean, it's really nice to hear how the research is going, but also know that I'm very lucky that the adoption with my children has always kind of fallen in line with that, with face-to-face contact and stuff. So initially I was having one face-to-face contact a year and one letterbox a year, and that went on for about 6 years, and then we started to scrap the letterbox contact and have 2 face-to-face contacts a year. And then COVID happened. And then I had my third child, who has had no social service involvement at all. And actually it was when my other children who were adopted were meant to meet my son for the first time that so the social worker had always been involved. I'd always had someone in the middle, kind of like supervising the contact and stuff. And she'd had a family emergency and couldn't make it, and was like, look, I don't need to be there. It's totally up to you guys if you want to just go ahead. So we did. We went ahead, went to their house. So I'd actually been to their house once before as well. So I'd been to their house. And then we've kind of gone on from there, having two contacts a year. Plus I speak to predominantly one of the adopters quite regularly. We have regular catch-ups and stuff like that. And just last week, my children came to my house, which also wasn't meant to happen. But my son was sick, so they were like, do you want us to just come to you, so at least you can still see the boys and they can still see you guys, which I think I'm still processing, because they came home. They came home, and obviously it's not for good, it's not forever, but they came home, and it's a massive thing, like having them in my house. And my eldest son's 6'3", so I mean that was never my I always like dreamt of them coming back and they'd still be little, like the age that they were when they left. So they're nearly adults, and it's just crazy. Times have changed, but I mean, it's watching them grow and being able to be here in this home and ask questions, and when you speak about identity and all of that, and understanding and knowing like where they're from, and even being able to like I had a blanket here that was my middle son's blanket my mum had made when he was born, and my eldest child has got his one already, but for some reason I ended up with my middle son's one, and I was able to give it to him. I'm like, oh, like I've actually, it's on the back of the door and this is yours, and he was able to take it away. And it's like, after all those years, it's nice.
That's lovely. And there's a lot of talk about relationships and relational approaches, isn't there, Rich? But I mean, the trust and the relationship that Clarissa has managed to build with, that graphic that Julie had about all the different people in the system, the fact that you've been able to build those connections and work as a team together is really a wonderful thing. It's great to hear about that. Rich.
Yeah, that was really special. Thank you for sharing that, Clarissa. And I think you're a real kind of you're a real testament really to the possibility for parents changing, and a real kind of living, breathing example of why we need to rethink about how and why we do adoption. Because I think there's been certain beliefs and myths that have been held about how we support adopted children that have taken hold for too long, I think, and have been left unexamined for too long. And I think Julie's research and our next presenter, Brige, is shining a light on that as well, and doing some brilliant work to help us rethink. Because for me, when I first became a social worker in 2010, it was just default that you recommended that there was no contact. It wasn't even up for examination. And now when I think about that and I look back, I just think that's absolutely absurd. And I do think that in 30, 40, 50 years, the way in which we've handled adoption, particularly around contact, we'll look back and we'll just despair ourselves. And but fortunately, that's why having this conversation and the work that you're doing, Clarissa and Julie and Brige, is so valuable. So yeah. So should we hand it over to Brige now, Tim? Great. So I'm going to hand over to Brige Featherstone, who I think everybody will agree needs no introduction. So I'll just I'll hand it straight over to you, Brige.
Oh, thanks, Rich. Can you just keep an eye on the time for me, because I'm very aware of. So just kind of wag a finger at me or something if I go over the 15 minutes. Thank you so much for asking me to be part of this. I'm going to talk about a piece of work that I did with Anna Gupta, who I know a lot of you will know, and Sue Mills was our researcher, and we were commissioned by BASWA back in 2000, well, it was in 2015, we started in 2016, and we finished in 2018. And it is really interesting to go back to that. I read the report again this morning and to reflect on it in the context of what you're talking about today, because as Rich said, it really brought me in touch with a lot of the emotions I had around that work and around how contested adoption is. And it's a bit of a cautionary tale, really, this, because it's not just, as Rich says, that we didn't even really think for a long time about the model of contact, but also it was really tricky to even open up discussions about the fact that adoption involved a whole range of people. It was often posed in a way as if adoption was about children and adoptive parents. And there were lots of voices silenced in that process, crucially, the voices of birth parents. And so when we were commissioned to, when we were commissioned by BASWA to do the inquiry, there were a number of reasons why BASWA commissioned us. One is the role of the social worker is obviously crucial at every stage of the adoption process, and they wanted to engage with that around the topics of ethics and human rights. Why those topics? Well, at the time, adoption has always been part of the childcare landscape in the UK. It's always been needed for, say, when children's parents die or a child is abandoned. There is obviously a space for adoption for children who have no parents. But over time, particularly the function of adoption and the purpose of adoption had really started to change. And to cut a very, very, very long story short, from 2010 onwards, there seemed to be a really very big policy push. It's not that Labour hadn't engaged with adoption, they had, but this was quite a different context. The Tory government, and the coalition government before that, when they came in, they cut family support, they cut a lot of services for birth families, they cut a lot of the welfare benefits. There was an austerity programme, as you know, which continues actually. And in that context, the promotion of adoption and the pushing of adoption started, if you like, to take on a different set of meanings for many people. So adoption under Labour, where you had Sure Starts, where you had a concerted attack on child poverty, where you had a whole range of supports for families across the piece, as well as indeed for residential care, seemed to be quite a different policy proposition to a period where actually the space and supports for birth families were shrinking. And BASWA were worried about that from an ethical and human rights perspective. Again, to cut a long story short, why were we so controversial though? Because the inquiry was controversial. There's no point in denying it. It was partly maybe because Anna and I were seen maybe wrongly actually as anti-adoption because we tended to support family support. We were seen as quite controversial. But also I think there was even, and this is important for us to remember going forward, that there can be a groupthink and an orthodoxy around a policy context that it is hard to open up and to kind of shake up. And there was at that time. The government was saying virtually it's a happy ever after narrative. Adoptive parents were challenging that with their concerns for a support, but they weren't challenging the focus on adoption. But there was a general belief that adoption was per se a good thing. So what we tried to do in the inquiry was to model a very open approach, though, to adoption. So we had seminars and events where we brought together everyone. And it's a bit like what you're trying to do in relational activism, this notion of co-design. And we brought together adoptive parents, adopted people over the age of 16, social workers, birth parents, and we brought them together in a room for a day, and they were profoundly powerful. The one in Wales in particular, I still think about what we've just been talking about. I still remember the birth parents saying there, I was so angry, I didn't write for years. I didn't write because I didn't know how to describe myself. I hated the word tummy mummy. I was much more than that. And the adoptive parents saying, I don't know what to write in the letters. If I talk about the gifts we gave at Christmas, if I talk about like where we're going on holiday, is that boasting? How will that be perceived by the birth parent? This was way pre-COVID, and yet people in that little group were talking about when letters didn't arrive, how they worried that the adoptive parent was ill, that the child had died. I remember a social worker in that group, and this is where it was really valuable, having multiple perspectives. The social worker was saying, you know, it's really hard. She was a letterbox contact person. The adoptive parents have had a really bad accident in one case, she said. But I can't, they don't want me to tell the birth parents. So they're not writing, and I can't tell the birth parents why they're not writing. So having everyone in the same room brought home in this really vivid way some of the challenges of letterbox contact. Anyway, we did other things. We had a conventional research approach. We had focus groups. We talked to members of the judiciary. We talked to young people who had been adopted. Quorum helped us to access a group of young people who had been adopted who were very clear about the problems with some of the letterbox work. And so there were some key messages that came out of the inquiry when it was launched. And you will find them completely uncontroversial, actually. The first one was, though, that it was vital that the perspectives of all impacted by adoption should be heard, and that we should not be running events where you just had adoptive parents speaking, which was happening actually at the time. You would have adoption weeks where there would be very little focus on the voices of even adopted young people. And we thought we need to hear from everyone who's involved in adoption, and they need to be on platforms together, talking to each other. We weren't saying it would be easy, but we were saying that the perspectives of all impacted. And crucially, since then, you know, the work of kind of people like Karen Broadhurst and stuff on birth parents, the work of people in this room, Clarissa's work, PFAN, all these groups has been really important in opening up. But I think it's really important to remember this didn't always happen. The fact that we have birth parents now talking on platforms about what it's like to be involved with the child protection system, what it's like to have your children taken away, this is relatively recent. And this means that, you know, as an old lady who has seen progress come and go, we always have to keep fighting for things. They're not automatically, definitely there forever. The kind of current situation we're in could be possibly rolled back. We have to keep challenging things. So that was one of our first messages, that all the voices must be heard. And I'm very influenced by the American feminist Rebecca Solnit, and I argue very strongly always that who's heard and whose stories are able to be told tells us an awful lot about who's valued in our society and what value we attach to which stories. So if we have platforms where we don't have birth parents or adopted people on the platform, we are giving out messages about who's valued. The second thing we said was, which you've already talked a lot about, is that there needed to be a really big rethink of approaches to contact, and that there were huge problems with the letterbox contact, but why weren't we thinking about direct contact? Since then, I have to tell you, I really think that we're onto a new set of issues that we need to talk about in relation to contact, which are actually very painful to talk about, which, you know, realistically, we live in a very divided and unequal society. it's riven by poverty. And one of the things I want us to think about as we go forward is, how do we manage direct contact when there are such disparities between birth parents often and adoptive parents? How do we manage issues like birthday presents or non-birthday presents or holidays? And there are quite complex questions around money, and in the case of letterbox contact, where people can't talk about love or things are redacted, there are things we need to face up to as we move forward with direct contact. And that won't be easy. We've just written an article about that if people are interested. Thirdly, we talked about, which you know, that the model of adoption where children are issued with a new birth certificate, it's extraordinarily strange, particularly in a context where there is divorce, where we have people with step families, where the family forms are very diverse. And yet we've imposed a very rigid model of identity on a particularly vulnerable group of young people, where they're expected to move from one family and become a new person with a new identity in a different family. And of course, what we picked up in the inquiry and what Julie's work is showing and what Clarissa's living is, that's not the way we do family. That's not the way people live their lives. We carry the past with us in the present. We reflect on the future and its relationship with the past. We met middle-aged adoptive parents who were still doing adoption every day of their lives, making decisions about who they tell, who they don't tell. We met very sad situations where adopted people had said to us, I didn't want to search till my adoptive parents were dead because I didn't want to hurt them. And then when I searched, the birth parents were dead. And so the model we have is very rigid. It's curious fiction, really, that we can replace, that we can make new people almost through this process. And it has been leaking. Social media has just adequately pushed how leaky it is and how messy it is. In a new chapter, actually, going forward, that it's really interesting. Avery Bowser, who's an adoptive father from Northern Ireland, who was a really helpful throughout the inquiry in all sorts of ways, and he's a social worker in Northern Ireland. He's written a chapter recently on the future of adoption. And I want to finish with this. He locates it in the context of the review of children's social care that Josh McAllister chaired and that has reported earlier this year, where he notes actually that there is very little talk about adoption in that review. Lots of talk about special guardianship and lots of talk about supporting fostering. And Avery does ask us to think not just about contact, not just about modernizing the issue of contact, but he does ask us to think about whether the particular model of adoption that we have developed, which really closes down all sorts of legal possibilities for children, opens up others, whether that might be something that we want to think about. If you're interested in our report, we have lots and lots of quotes from young people about what it was like moving from a different class, a different culture, what it was like leaving siblings behind. We have lots of quotes from birth parents. We also have lots of quotes from adoptive parents who are really, really trying their best in what were often very difficult circumstances. So I'm going to leave it there. Is that okay? Have I talked too long? You're mute, Tim.
Rich, you're on mute, yeah.
Sorry, Bruce, I was just saying, no, that was absolute perfect timing. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah, I really love that, what you're saying about your influence of Rebecca Solnit and how all voices must be heard. And I think maybe one of the significant challenges as a social worker is to be able to hold on to these competing thoughts and feelings and perspectives of the multiple people that you're working with. And often in our attempt to kind of deal with the challenges of the work that we do, we just develop these simplified narratives or these simplified viewpoints, or we exclude certain perspectives so that we don't have to deal with the cognitive kind of complexity of everything that we're being asked to deal with. So I really appreciate that. And we're going to now transition over to Beverley Barnett-Jones, who is an associate director at the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory and a member of the Royal Foundation Centre for the Early Childhood Advisory Group, which is a very lovely sounding title. And just going to try and bring you into the mix, EBJ.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, lovely. Thank you for I really have just deeply listened to both Bridge and to Julie's talk, and it's been just a wonderful exploration of the complexity of the debate and the thinking and the feeling about adoption. And Carissa, thank you so much for sharing that event in your life. That's huge, love. That is so huge. My heart is bursting for you. It's so huge. And obviously huge processing. I just want to start with something I'm just going to read to you, which made me kind of think about where I situate myself as that social worker that was operating adoption under the 76 Act. That's how long I've been in the game, as well as the Adoption and Children Act, and the differences that I see as I've gone through the journey. And it starts with this: being adopted is like having a double life. Being a writer is like having a double life. You live in two worlds at once, your imaginary one and the so-called real one. When you're adopted and you trace your original parents, these two worlds start to collide. I remember feeling a strange grief when I found my real birth mother. I grieved for the one I had made up, who had been in my imagination all along. That's a quote from the wonderful Jackie Kay, poet, and many of you know her, that she wrote an important trilogy of poetry called The Adoption Papers in 1991. And that always shaped my approach to that piece of work in 1991 really shaped my approach to adoption as a practitioner. So it also shaped me in terms of being a person who was care experienced as a Black person in care, only for a short period, but in the 70s, and what that felt like for us as a family. And so I really struggled with adoption. So when I was doing adoption work, I always had in mind an idea around an openness and a continued need for continued connection and family. So that meant that I would often be in a world of collision myself as a practitioner, arguing for how do we work with and support mums and dads whose children were going through an adoption process, and how do we build those connections and relationships. And I can say to you that in that practice space, particularly before the Adoption and Children Act, which was a New Labour, wasn't it? New Labour piece of legislation. It was the white paper. I remember it all, Bridge. I remember all of what happened around how adoption became the permanency journey for New Labour, alongside its macroeconomic, every child matters stuff. Adoption, what they did around adoption was really problematic for me, really big time, because it was used as the promotion, the best, this best option for children. But I remember very much being in a space as a social worker where you were working very closely. There wasn't a lot of adoption for starters. It was, and it still isn't now today, huge numbers of adoptions. We have to remember this. It's a small number of children that go for adoption. But when I was practicing in those early days, you had a very close connection to the families that you were working with as a practitioner. You were working with families quite intensely. You were social working families quite intensely. And when adoption became the option in the planning for children, you were working with those. You were doing all the direct work with that birth parents. So you were always meeting the adopter. There was always meeting with the adopter and the adopters meeting the parents. And there'd been an idea that you establish a continued connection. Now, it was letters. We didn't have the digital spaces and all the stuff we have now. But the idea that you didn't do that was really strange to me. And so I would do that work a lot. And then when I became a children's guardian, I would always want an open adoption. I would always look at all those existing connections with children had with their grandparents, children had with their uncles, they had with their aunties, they had with mum's best friend. I'd always argue that we need to maintain these relationships. And I met a system that was really unable, Julie, those days to process that or deal with that. It had a real kind of mantra around what we do, why we are, creating this fantasy idea with a brand new family. It's all about rescuing kids. It's all about the love story, and it's all going to be fine. It was a massive denial of the harm that adoption brings, because it brings trauma. It breaks relationships. So those are human relationships, and we had to be able to kind of talk in that way and acknowledge the truth of that. If we were going to say and truly say that there are circumstances where some children, beyond even what we described, that where adoption will be in their best interest, that's a decision you're dealing with as a social worker in the system. Those are the things that you're working with. That's the process of the system you're working with. So when I came back to the world of adoption many years later, coming into the NFGO, you know, and picking up the work, it struck me that there were people that I met, like Carissa, the work that you do, Bridget, like Julie, you know, like Beth, you know, like lots of people on this call today, who had really begun to understand and say, you know, something different needs to happen here. You know, this isn't working for anybody. This is causing a world of pain for people. And a little project work I did, which is around continued connections through using digital. Actually, what that really was around, it wasn't around modernizing content. It was around what is adoption, you know, and what are we doing in adoption, and how do we reduce the pain of the collision for young children who do go for adoption? How do we reduce the pain of the collision for their families? And it makes sense to me, totally to me, it makes sense that we think about from day one, you know, how do we think about that child? How do we imagine that child? Like Jackie says, how do we not have a lack of imagination, but imagine that child's journey, that child's needs, and what that child is going to need. And it's going to need to have a whole load of knowledge and understanding about the family it came from, because that family continues to go on and continues to grow. It doesn't change, you know, your family is there. So you are imagining as that adoptive child, and this is what young people told us as well. We've all done that piece of work, we've all pulled it together, but you are always thinking about that family when you become an understanding about your situation, a family that you weren't born into. You know, you are therefore have a family that exists and carries on. And the job of this, I think the job of the work of change that I'm involved with now, that Julie was kind of outlining, is trying to create, you know, a context where when you're approaching somebody who says, I want to take and raise somebody else's child as though they were my own, the question is, you know, they're not owned by you. Do you get me? They're not your own in that sense. They already have a connection. They already have a family. It's like, how do you raise them to give them the security and love that they require in your family life that you want to provide for them, integrating the understanding that they have a family. You know, they are loved in a place. There is a whole existence here that they're not accessing on a daily basis, but that's a life for them. That's a parallel life for them that you need to somehow work around integrating and supporting and connecting with. So it just seems to me, you know, that there's a load of research about open adoption, the difficulties of open adoption, but it just seems to me, you know, that, you know, Julie, today when I hear somebody say, when I hear the concepts of the goodbye contact disappearing, then I know that we've made change. You know, when I get to that place where people aren't saying to me, we're changing the way we do goodbye contacts, we're being more sensitive. I'm like, you need more than sensitivity. You need to get down to the deep, which is that it's not a goodbye. Do you get me? It's never a goodbye for that lived family of the birth family. It's never goodbye for that child, and it's never goodbye for the adopter. I've got Al on the screen now, I can see you out. It's never goodbye for the adopter, because that family continues to exist in that adopter's mind with all sorts of worries and anxieties and stress. That's what I found. I found a system that was creating multiple points of pain and stress and upset across all of those connection points that Julie sort of identified. So the question you put there, Brid, around, you know, is adoption something that we should do? Is this legal route to permanency? Is this something that should we do? That's a question that we all have to keep on asking ourselves, because it is a world of loss, ambiguous loss for children. It is a world of loss for the birth family. It's a world of loss for the adoptive parent, because we tell adoptive parents to do something which is almost impossible to do. You know, we're asking them to do something which is almost impossible to do. So you ask them to kind of integrate all of this child's story and journey and experiences, but you also sort of telling them as well, you know, you're the exclusive parent and you're doing something. It's a very difficult place to navigate and understand. And I don't think there are solutions. There were just continued conversations and continued reflections, and bringing it down for me into like, what are the relationships? You know, how do we support the relationships? So the reality of being a birth parent, you know, moving into an open adoption space or into a non-letterbox space, it requires all the absence of the psychological and practical support parents experience now, but it's also around the impact of poverty, you know, and that this is a reality. If you're going to be moving, you have to be thinking, who are you investing in? Where do the investments go to support a new system? You know, where did the investment go? it's going to have to be dealing with that reality of, which we found in our digital work, which is, digital poverty just meant that a lot of the families wouldn't be able to access some of these systems that we were talking about, because, the data, the cost, all the rest of it, the interaction, the connection, the ability to access, all of that is very, very real. But it reflects what we already see in terms of the disparities and inequalities. We know that birth families don't get the support, don't get the assistance, don't get the long-term support that they need. But we also found that with adopters as well. We found that adopters were there crying and distressed because they weren't getting the support and the help that they needed for their children in a timely way that would make a difference for them in terms of the care they were giving. So it's a system full of a lot of pain and loss, so you do have to ask the question fundamentally about the nature of adoption. But I think the work that's going on is trying to address some of the obvious things that we can do to reduce, and I suppose, bring that love, that love and that sense of like, how do you continue to keep connection and love in a child's life, Why do we always just focus on the birth mum? Why aren't we thinking about the wider family? All of that stuff, in terms of the support. But I think I'm really reflecting on Brid's statement to us there. Do you get me? That is a question that we do have to keep asking ourselves as we go through thinking about the changes that we want to make. And the better world it is than it even was 10 years ago. It is better in lots of places in terms of some of the work that's going on to address what was identified. There is improvements, but yeah, there is a fundamental question there, that we have to keep in mind, because it is a world of pain, because it is about separation and loss.
Well, Beverley, as ever, you've brought your imagination to a very complex area, and always grateful for that. And I was, because we've given ourselves an extra 10 minutes just because this is so relevant and interesting. And Clarissa, be nice to hear from you again, and perhaps bring you into conversation with Beverley. I was thinking of all of the imagination that's needed, and to take something that, as Rich says, is often oversimplified, and imagine the relationships differently, to acknowledge, to try to understand that other people are involved in these situations and arrangements. And how was that for you to start to imagine the adopters that were there with your boys? How did that feel?
I mean, I've always done it though. Because I'm that type of a person anyway. It's like, even on Father's Day, like I always think about, the fact that that they're there raising my kids, and like, then even like birthdays and Christmas, and I'm wondering like, how stressful it must be for them, and and if they get sick, and I'm like, oh my God, like, I hope they know that they can reach out to me if they really needed to, like, and obviously my children are getting older and things change, things get more complicated in different ways, and I think that it's just nice to have that openness and to have that love between us. We get on really well, actually, and we have to have boundaries. We have very clear set boundaries, which I tend to always overstep, but I can't help it. And I think that he's learning, like, because I speak to one of them in particular, he's learning more about me and understanding me, which ultimately makes that relationship a lot easier. But one thing that Bridge actually said something about the birth certificate, like they get a new birth certificate, and it's funny because I just never really, I knew that their surnames would have changed and whatever, and I just never really thought about the fact that because they'd kept their first names, that their middle names would have changed. And they didn't know their original middle names either. So it was a really odd conversation when I saw them. It was actually the last time, not the one just now. And they were asking me like, what, like, because I saw something with their full name on it, and I was like, oh, your middle name is different. Like, and it just totally. And then they were asking me questions. They wanted to know their middle names and why and where they got it from, and but piecing that together at their young ages surely is better than leaving it until they're in their 50s, you know. The fact that they were able to stay together and have, you know, stay in like build their relationship as they grow, and that they've got contact with their younger sibling, and that's only going to get more and better. And well, I don't think we've got through the hardest part yet. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think my children are mature enough to be pushing and asking certain questions that are going to be difficult one day. But I'm just grateful that I've got this massive network of amazing, incredible people that have always guided and supported my true belief that being involved is the best, you know, being a part of it, and trying to blend families as much as possible. I think the one of the most difficult, challenging things for me is trying to co-parent with people that I'm not actually co-parenting with. And that's a whole different concept, and it's really difficult to even like explain, but I think it's an important part as well.
I really heard those reflections from Clarissa there, you know, because I think one of the things is that, you know, the problem about adoption was this, because of the sort of these policy contexts and these family policy contexts and these social policy contexts, it gets wrapped up as though it's solution to a particular set of problems. And of course, it isn't, is it? It isn't a solution to a particular set of problems around what happens to some of our families and some of our parents who, for whatever reason, are in, for many identifiable reasons, are in a world of complexity and trauma and harm, where the system is not helping them effectively. You know, he's not supporting them as people, he's not caring for them as people. A lot of people were people that were supposed to be cared for, the children of the state, all of that stuff. And somehow we think that the solution to that is that adoption was going to be a solution to the children of those children. Well, that's just nonsense, isn't it? That's just like sort of saying, you know, that's like sort of saying you're going to, you know, I don't know, is it the square peg in the round hole, whatever it is? It's silly, you know. But the reality is that, you know, adoption, as Bridget's saying, is being part of our landscape and childcare policy, and it will always be moved through that lens. So it's like, what do we do at the level of the relationships and those people on the ground, you know, doing the thinking around the changes in cultures, the changes in practices? What do we do about that, and hold the ground so we don't get the kickback? Because although we can present it like we're really moving forward, it isn't a consensus. You know, there are still people that are very much opposed to the idea that this is what we mean when we're talking about the movement of change around adoption. There are still people that are resistant to that, and there's still conversations to be had at a sort of, you know, governmental level, where people's conception is like, well, they're not interested in children, you get me, but they're not interested in the idea that you know, opening up adoption and opening it up, the whole idea of the child's continued connection and journey is something to be welcomed, because they think that puts off people taking children on, or they think it's like, why would you reward bad parents? It's full of all of that horrible, you know, politics, that horrible kind of ideology. It's still there. So the job of convincing people who have got who we elect, who make legislation, to think about like the identity rights of adopted children around their birth certificate, for instance, you know, and having a law change there. You get me? That you can't change the names, you get me? Or you don't bury the birth certificate and create the new one, but you have access, you know, you have both exist for you as that young person, you know, they both exist for you. Because, you know, adoption is, you know, the extinguishing of a parental right, do you get me? A legal right, you know, and then the story is the child becomes the legal child of that family. You know, these are big issues that we're so far away of getting a conversation about senior systems, you know, politicians, because they're in the world where they would still tell you, you know, adoption is God's choice for children. I mean, you know, one of our former previous children's ministers sort of said that. Do you get me? He's like, you know, it's God's choice for children. And I'm like, everybody rolled their eyes in the room like, Christ, we're really in trouble here, you know, because we need somebody who's going to really engage with the complexities of the discussion, isn't it? It's a human story, isn't it? It's a deep relational stuff. This is what this is, isn't it? The most in social care, you know, it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
You
I
know.
think that feels like the right place to finish up, Rich. Beverley there taking us to the heart of it and the most important. Yeah,
and I really am grateful for Julie and Briege and Beverley, and especially Clarissa, for coming on and speaking about this incredibly difficult and complex area. And the intention, as kind of Beverley pointed out, really isn't about prescribing solutions, but just generating a conversation and a space where we can think about different perspectives and the thoughts and feelings of other people from different angles, and from there see what comes of that. And I'd really recommend checking out Julie's research or the BASWA inquiry. That really actually shifted my perspective a lot, the BASWA inquiry that Briege and her colleagues were involved in. To see that Julie's put in maybe about a part 2, I think that would be a great idea. I feel like it's something that you could spend the whole day talking about easily. So thank you for everybody that was able to.
Yeah.
Maybe when you do your relational activism conference, you get me, we'll come along and have more time to talk about it all, isn't it? There's a throwback to you, Tim.
That's a really good idea. I think we need a part 2 for sure. And thank you everybody so much. We really appreciate being with you. And we'll Andrew helps us with the recording, and so the recording will be going up on the website and going up on YouTube. So we'll distribute that. And good to be with you all this lunchtime. Thank you so much. See you next time.